Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. When I did my clinical work at the state mental hospital here in Columbia while I was in seminary, I learned a wonderful story. The hospital campus used to be completely surrounded by a 10-foot-high brick wall. Normal society couldn't see in, and the patients couldn't see out. Eventually, theories of treating mental illness changed, and the wall was taken down. But if you drive by it today, you can still see a small portion of the wall they left to remind us of the time when mental illness was hidden away from society. They used the patients to take down the wall and to clean the brick. And what was most interesting was that during that time, they had the highest cure rate in the hospital's history. That makes sense. As the patients took down an actual wall, they were able to pull down the walls inside them as well. When they were finished, they used the brick to build the chapel for the campus, and they named it the Chapel of Hope. The NCAA basketball tournament is going on now, and we call that March Madness. And that invited the topic of looking at madness in the Bible. In fact, the Bible doesn't shrink from a realistic treatment of mental illness. People with various mental illnesses are described and responded to with compassion and understanding. Today we want to look at a story which is probably fictional, but which reflects mental illness as many of us might imagine it to be. Today we will talk about Nebuchadnezzar. To be honest, this probably isn't a story you are very familiar with. It comes from the book of Daniel, and that raises some interesting issues on its own. You see, Daniel's function in the Old Testament is similar to that of Revelation in the New Testament. Both are apocalyptic literature, using visions and dreams and stories to speak of end times. Daniel has stories of being thrown into the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walking in a furnace of fire, a disembodied hand writing on a wall, and much more. The point of it mostly seems to be similar to Revelation as well. It's hard to maintain your faith in a society far from God, but stay true and you will share God's victory. For most of the book of Daniel, the stories revolve around Daniel himself, a faithful Jew no matter what, and the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar. Historians describe Nebuchadnezzar as a great and powerful king, and in fact he is described in the book of Jeremiah as well. In Jeremiah he is understood as a good king, and in fact God calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant. There are even some who speculate that Nebuchadnezzar converted to the Jewish religion himself, and what we can say at the very least is that during his reign he served God's purpose. In the book of Daniel, the story is very different. Nebuchadnezzar is pictured as a vengeful, vain, self-aggrandizing tyrant. Our particular story involving madness is found in Daniel 4. In Babylon, Daniel had risen to a position of honor in the king's court, often advising the king. One of those situations came to pass when the king had a dream. In those days, they often thought that dreams were given by God to help prepare for the future, and so the king told his dream to his advisors to see how they would interpret it. None of them could, except for Daniel. He didn't want to tell the interpretation, but the king made him. Finally, Daniel described that the king would be driven from the palace and live like a wild animal for 7 years. Sure enough, that's just what happened. The Bible says, "All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king said, 'Is this not magnificent Babylon, which I have built as a royal capital by my mighty power and for my glorious majesty?' While the words were still in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared, the kingdom has departed from you. You shall be driven away from human society, and your dwelling shall be with the animals of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you, until you have learned that the Most High has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals, and gives it to whom he will. Immediately the sentence was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven away from human society, ate grass like oxen, and his body was bathed with the dew of heaven, until his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails became like birds' claws. Some of the mental illness I saw while I worked at the state hospital might be described in much the same ways. For 7 years, the king was away from normal human society, wandering and living like an animal. And in some ways, I wonder if we aren't all suffering in a similar way all the time. The hymn, God of Grace and God of Glory, has a verse that seems to describe the many ways we have all wandered far from the family of God. Cure your children's warring madness. Bend our pride to your control. Shame our wanton selfish gladness, rich in things and poor in soul. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage, lest we miss your kingdom's goal. Lest we miss your kingdom's goal. Our own madness is marked by pride and selfishness, by self-centeredness and lack of concern for others. This isn't God's way. After 7 years, there was grace for Nebuchadnezzar, and he was restored to his place on the throne. As we seek God's wisdom, as we seek courage and faith, as we strive for the goal of the kingdom, may our walls come down. May we live in grace and hope. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.